with my students. So I realize we all have a lot on our plate. I just wanted to really briefly kind of share a little bit of my exploration of where you guys are coming from. I was looking at which BOCES district you were in, and sort of familiar with that concept from my work with the New Tech Network for 2 years ago before I came back to the classroom. And I started to think about the fact that you guys, some of you are in Putnam County, correct? I think. And I actually live in Putnam County, Indiana. Myself, teach at a school called South Putnam, of all places. And I've really lived here most of my life, except for, you know, some of my adult years when I went and professionalized and then came back home to raise my kids. But I also was thinking about how beautiful it is where you guys are. And I was like, how do I know this? And then it occurred to me that I hiked right through your district 20 years ago gosh, I'm so old. 20 years ago next year, I thru-hiked the Appalachian Trail. And that runs right near where you guys are. And so kudos for living in a beautiful part of the country. West Point, I remember crossing the Hudson and seeing that majestic place and thinking about all of the history that you guys live in there. So just really pleased to be able to maybe, I don't know, impact, work with, learn with you guys today. And just want to share that little bit of connection that I felt as I sort of was digging into, you know, who I'd be talking with and so on and so forth. So I am, just full disclosure, I'm a very big fan of interactives and trying to make things as, I guess, personal as you can. And this is kind of a weird space for me because I don't know most of you. But I want to encourage you to engage with the Padlet I'm going to share here in a moment. If you choose to, ask questions in the chat because I think it'll just make more sense. So I try to use the full breadth of an experiential learning cycle in sort of preparing what I have for you today. So I'm going to try to share my screen here. Get this together. All right. There we go. All right, that should be good. I think you guys should be able to see that. For those of you who would like to access this slide deck and some of the resources, that tiny URL right there, you're more than welcome to take a minute and type that in if you would like to, and put that into your browser. If you are the kind of person that would like to just follow along, or maybe you like to jump ahead, although I wouldn't necessarily encourage that, you're welcome to open this up on your own device. But it's just tinyurl.com / Leah Ross Henry culture, and that will take you to the folder with some of our resources we're going to look at today. So I've been a big fan of exploring culture and its role in the classroom, I don't know, probably for the last decade and a half, which is, you know, professionally, my first 5 years of education, I was just trying to figure out if I even wanted to do this. And I felt like a lot of what I was doing was just swimming in the same place and treading water in just a spot, and I never really get anywhere. And I was introduced to some ideas, again, through my work organization as a teacher. And this is a diagram that I've kind of modified for my own purposes. But when I saw this particular diagram for the first time, and I thought about my classroom and what I've been trying to do, I realized instruction and assessment, and then discipline policies were all kind of where I focused my energy a lot, right? Because I thought that would lead to student achievement. And it was really amazing that once I switched to really focusing on what a lot of you already know, because you're veterans, that culture and relationships are the key thing that you build on to get those other things to work, right? So that led me to think, especially the last few months, how do we build this bridge, or how do we create a virtual culture that is as strong or stronger than the one we have in our physical space? And furthermore, am I taking the time in my physical space to really purposefully embed the culture that I want to be realized, right? Like, does that happen in a very prescriptive, in a very strategic manner, right? So the bulk of sort of what I've been thinking and writing about and trying to practice too, as we shifted to a virtual setting in my classes as well, is how do I build this healthy culture around learning in the virtual space? So that leads us to our Padlet. And this is one where, you know, if you're able to toggle between Zoom and able to go to the Padlet, you can. This is, I think Paul can, I don't know if he can copy and paste that or not. Let me put this here. I'm going to exit. I think I'm going to have to paste that into our chat window, which is totally.
Leah, I can, oh, you got it? Okay, I was going to rewrite it over there, but feel free if you want to copy and paste, up to you.
So I'll paste it into our chat window, and I also put a QR code there. So if you want to get that on your phone, you can always take a picture of that. So it's in the chat window. If you want to head on over to that Padlet, I have a, hold on, everyone. Put it in there. There we go. I have a Padlet pulled up for you guys to kind of respond to. And so just want you to think about that question, what is culture? Like, what is school? Like, what is a classroom culture? What, and you hear that word, what do you think of? And there's no wrong answer here. And you guys are welcome to just add to this post-it, if you will, here in the Padlet. And you don't even have to put your name. It's all anonymous. Let's just see what we come up with for the next, let's take 2 minutes. So see a few responses in there. Thank you so much for adding in there. A way of being, shared community, a feeling, yeah, everything, community again, a way of existing, a way of being, a way of existing. Those are all great. I think it's interesting that one of you guys mentioned the feeling because that's one of the hardest parts. I think the virtual space is like feeling this space is really hard, right? Like, especially if people, like if your camera's off or there's things going on in the background, like you're like, oh man, are they listening? Like, it's hard to read the room, right? When there's a virtual space. And if you want to keep adding to this, we're going to use this again here in just a second. So I want to present a definition for you. And those of you who have kind of clicked on the slide deck, I've already seen this, but I really am a fan of being clear about like what we're talking about whenever there's like a concept, right? So for our purposes, let's use this definition. And this is from Heifetz. And I'm going to actually read this out loud because it's helpful for me to just like think about it. And I would welcome you too if you're on mute. An organization's culture is made up of its folklore, its rituals, its group norms, and its meeting protocols. So Heifetz is writing about like a school organization, right? But I always think about how this is so transferable to every level of an organization. So if I take these and I think about like a classroom's folklore, your classroom's rituals, the norms of your classroom, the group norms of your classroom. And then if I change the word meeting to classroom protocols, those are the tangible, the things that we can sort of name, right? That maybe you don't necessarily feel, but you can name that make up your culture of your classroom. So to that end, and I'm going to transition back here. This is one of my challenges in moving back to a school setting. For a long time I had a MacBook, and now I'm relearning how to use like a Chromebook and those kind of things. So on my Chromebook, I'm going to go back to our Padlet, and I'm going to make a new tab. And I want us to think about the first one, folklore. What is the folklore surrounding like your class culture? What are the stories children tell about your classroom? Or what are the stories you hope they would tell, right? So see if you can add to that in the same Padlet. So what are those stories that they tell? And I'm going to add a couple in here too, and then demonstrate a few. And while you're doing that, I'm going to add a couple more to our Padlets for you to comment on too. So what are the norms, right? Or the like ways of being in your classroom? And then what are the classroom protocols? What would those look like? Or what are, if you could name or think of some of those classroom protocols, let's add those to that part of the Padlet. And then I'm missing one. I am missing rituals. So I'm going to add rituals on there too. And just add your comment, like what are the classroom rituals? Or even if you don't do them, but ones you think of that happen from time to time. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to think of those and add to our Padlet there. So one thing I noticed about Padlet is sometimes it'll say at the top like refresh. So if you got that message, you need to refresh it to see what other people have written. We got some good notes in here. I developed a couple ideas or some lists of uh, ones too that we can look at to kind of get you thinking about like what your classroom culture actually is, because truly the first step in identifying like how do I design like a virtual culture, a physical culture, whatever, is kind of take an inventory of what the heck you already got, right? So let's go back here and look at some examples of what these could be. And you guys are on the right track. And there's some overlap. You're like, is that folklore? Is that norms? What is that, right? Like, which one's which? So folklore usually is like the stories people tell, right, about your class. This is the sort of like, I like to say, this is what those moms and dads say on Facebook when somebody says, oh, my daughter has so-and-so's class, right? Like that's that. So what are those stories that people are going to talk about regards to your class? And I used she in here because I was thinking about like my class, and I don't know if these are all true for me, but these are just some ways that you could think about like the folklore, right? Is your class organized? Are you a hot mess? You know, those kind of stories. They care for all the students. Your pass fail rate, those kind of things, that all those stories that people sort of tell when they think about your classroom. And I think about my son, and he's in first grade, and the stories that he tells about his educator and the way that she interacts with them is that she's no nonsense mama, but she loves us, right? That's the folklore of her class. So that's one way to think about folklore. Let's look at rituals. So all of these are ones that I've either observed in coaching educators or I've done myself. So a lot of these are ones that you've probably heard of. A couple of these I'll clarify. Like Employee of the Week, I worked at a school where our focus was on professionalism. So we didn't have Students of the Week in classes, we had Employees of the Week to kind of model that culture of getting kids ready for the professional world. Whatever You Want Wednesday was a ritual that I had with an English teacher I co-taught with, where on Wednesdays they had free writing time to write whatever they wanted. And every child just looked forward to Whatever You Want Wednesday because it was just freedom, right? The passing of the keys, that's something I've seen a number of schools do, where they have like monthly passing of a key or an emblem that represents core values of their culture of their school. But you could also do something similar in a classroom, maybe every 9 weeks or something. You know, student who exhibits a lot of agency or mindfulness or kindness or gratitude or things like that. Some of these you guys mentioned in your notes on the Padlet, like greeting at the door, like that's a ritual a lot of us do, right? We've been sort of trained to do that, but it's a big part of why we don't like what we're doing right now with virtual learning, right? We don't get that live interaction with our kiddos. And then, you know, warm-ups, bell ringers, depending on the structure of those would be kind of rituals, right? You get into a norm of doing that, like it's your ritual. You do it every single time. And then the last one, they're writing letters to students around winter holidays. A lot of teachers I work with do that. I do it around like Thanksgiving. But those are all sort of rituals that maybe are embedded into our classroom. This one is a big one, group norms and community agreements. Like, what are the norms of your classroom? Like, what is just normal? Is it just normal for students to come in, hang out for 10 minutes, then get to work? Or is it normal for everybody to come in and get going, right? Like, that's part of your norms. So I just wrote a few in here that I thought about, that I've seen, or that maybe have occurred in my room, or that we've actually articulated, which we'll get to in just a second. But what are the ways of being in your classroom currently? And you got to be honest with yourself when you're kind of assessing it. Like, what is it right now? Like, what is it in the virtual space even, right? Are we coming? Are we not coming? Why might that be? And then the last one, class protocols or decision making. Who makes the decisions? Is it all teacher driven? Is it student driven? Do you have daily posted agendas, so on and so forth? These are all ways to sort of create opportunities to eliminate vagueness, right? Like protocols, structures that help facilitate a really effective classroom. So these are all, again, in this slide deck, if you want to go back and kind of think about them, where are you at, right? What is your current state? And then you move into this place of like, what do I want it to be for not only my physical classroom, but my virtual classroom? And that is really the essence of what I want to think about today with you guys. Like, we're so embedded in our physical space, but what about our physical space can sort of transcend and move into that virtual space, right? So what do we want for our learners, whether they're working on a device at home or wherever, or they're at our building with us? What do we want for them? How do we want them to engage in the work? And what role do you want to play in that? That's a big question. Do we want it to be more student-driven or facilitator-driven? And then how do we get the most student engagement? Because that is the number one problem, at least from all the educators I've been working with right now, is engagement. How do we keep students engaged in the learning process when we know they can sleep in, when we know they're up until 1 o'clock in the morning playing God knows what on the video games, right? Like, how do we get them to engage in the work when there's a million distractions? So how do we design a culture that will lead to that? So I created a couple matrices. One's blank for you guys to use if you want to, make a copy. And then I filled out one. And I'm going to go to those. I'm going to copy, I think, in the chat window. They're also in the folder. So if you're already there, I'll post that in the chat. I'm going to share my filled out one. There we go. I'm also going to share it on the screen. So what I did was I sat down and I thought to myself, what would I like, regardless of whether it's digital or physical, what would I like for my culture to be? And as I'm going through these, if you have questions that sort of pop up in your head, please put them in the chat window, and I'll get to those here in a second. But what I did is I went through and I said, okay, here's my desired outcome on the far left, right? Like, I want a connection, personal connection with each student, whether or not that's physical or digital. I want them to know that I care about them and I know who they are, right? I want my classroom, I want the culture to be student-centered, right? I don't want it to be all about Henry. I want it to be about them. I want students to be excited about classwork, right? This is all the things all of us want, I hope. I want open communication. If this time, apart from my students in the virtual space, has taught me anything, it's daggone, we've got to be better about multiple ways to communicate and teaching them that. So I want that. I want open communication. A respectful dialogue. Like, how do I create this back and forth that is always respectful? And that's something I'm striving for all the time in my history classes, right? Like, we have a lot of tricky subjects we talk about. Trust. I want that for my classroom. I want that culture to be one of trust, that you can trust that I'm going to deliver. I'm going to trust you to come through. So I went through and I started with those. And then I said, okay, what would that look like? What would I do? How would I form that in the physical space? And then I looked and I said, okay, so what would that look like in a digital space? How would I create this personal connection with each student in a digital space? And then over on the far right, I kind of looked at my two columns and I said, okay, what do I need to do to make sure that regardless of next year, if I'm physical or I'm digital, I've got a plan that will meet both needs, right? And when would I do that work? So you'll see sort of my thinking and the way that I went through that process there in this matrix that I filled out. So a big piece of my pie here is to create a survey, a student survey, and also share my reason for being an educator earlier than I normally would have. And I usually share a pretty personal story with them. It actually relates to the Appalachian Trail that I told you about that I hiked. back in the day, because when my sister passed away, I planned on becoming lieutenant governor before that. And then after she passed, that didn't seem to be as much as an important thing to me. And I volunteered with the girls' basketball team. And then I said, daggone it, I want to do this. I want to be able to just kind of be a good influence and be a good role model for all these kids and help them deal with really horrible stuff that's going to happen in their life. That's why I'm here. I switched my major. And then I hiked the Appalachian Trail to raise money for lupus, which is the disease she died of. But that's my why. And I share that with kids every year. But maybe I should do that in a video. And maybe I should have that ready to go in a virtual space too. Never thought about that before. So all of my sort of next steps are there on the right side, the far right side, but they all are mergers of the two columns, if that makes sense. So I'm going to pause for a second and see. That kind of leads to sort of any questions from folks. Or if you want to go off mute, feel free to do that too. Does this make sense? Is this something that you've thought about? Any questions about sort of this matrix or the way this is kind of looking?
And feel free to unmute and chime in if you've got some feedback and ideas based on what Leah shared. And you can also use the raise hand feature if you like, you know, and I'll make sure to call on you.
Yeah, and truly, I know there's like a lot here, and some of you might be just kind of looking at that and digesting and thinking, oh, those are things I do. These are things that are possible to do in the classroom, be it virtual or digital.
Leah, I've got a question. One of the things that I wonder a little bit about is some of those big buckets that are really different as we think of building culture and community in a physical space and a virtual one. You've laid it out kind of nicely with those table cells, right? Those separate columns. But I wonder, as you've done some of this work and done some of this thinking, there are some areas that are kind of like extensions, right? Like things that you can do really pretty well in both a physical and a digital space, and then some things that are really pretty different. What are some of the real significant differences that you're seeing? Things where like just a substitution doesn't work as well. Is there anything that sticks out?
I think the number one piece of that, and I saw this when I did a lot of virtual learning work with adults too, is the need to do like one-on-one phone calls with students. And in our case, parents, and let them know, being really clear about why you're calling their child, why you're expecting them to, you know, have their video on in their meeting, and getting the support of their team at home, right? So that is the sort of the outside influence, especially, you know, our younger kids. You know, when my son was doing his virtual meetings the last week, I just put him in a room and let him be in there. But then there are other parents who are right there next to their child the whole time, you know, monitoring the whole situation. And it has to do, I think, with some of that with a level of trust with what's going on. And so building that trust with the parents is going to be super key in these situations where maybe you haven't established that before. Maybe your folklore, right, isn't strong enough, so to speak, to preempt the need to get that trust. A lot of my students' parents are people that I went to high school with. So there's a lot of that, like, oh, it's Leah, right? Like, no big deal. But the students who don't have that, their family doesn't have that knowledge of me, I have had to pick up the phone and call them frequently. And this is coming from somebody who worked really hard to build a culture of trust in my classroom. I wrote these parents letters, like physical letters, last fall. And just having one or two phone calls with their mom and dad has made the world of difference in reestablishing the culture I worked hard in the classroom for. So yes, like that is the biggest thing to me. And I would say just that outside influence sphere, right? That goes back to your community agreements. When you talk with your students about what it takes to be fully present in a virtual space, or what it takes to be able to get their work done, you're going to have to help each of those individual students think about what that means for them at home. So I've got one student who said all of his dogs have to be out of the house for him to get any work done. And that's something we don't have in our culture at school, but he recognizes that that's what he has to do. So he locks himself in his room, he puts on his headphones to cancel some noise, and he gets his stuff done. But we had to talk about how to do that, right? And that took that one-on-one conversation about what does this norm mean for you?
So thanks, Leah. One of our participants, and feel free to unmute if you want to expand on this, wrote in the chat something that I know I've been thinking about too in relation to students and adult learners also, right? About the importance of talking with students about their own wants and needs and expectations right at the start of the year. And so one of the things that I wonder a little bit about is how will that process be different, right? If we're in kind of like a virtual or blended space. And I don't have your first name, but right, Settlesburg, right? I don't know if you want to chime in and add anything to that, or if I kind of captured what your thinking was with that chat item.
I think you got the idea. I just, it helps me learn a lot about the students. It gives me a lot of information right from the beginning about where they're coming from, and helps me to make maybe some adjustments in my own plans, going forward. Do they like, small group work? They feel more comfortable, working as a whole class. Are they shy? What are the personal attributes? This is for chorus, for instance. So it's, if they can let me know that, yeah, I don't really want to get up and sing in front of the class, which I wouldn't really put them up alone, but it's helpful for me to know.
Don't you think that maybe, if we are in a virtual sort of space, between sort of like having a phone call conversation with like individual students, and then also like having a really well thought out survey, right? Like I hate, you don't want to have death by surveys, right? Like it'd be good if you could collaborate with some other teachers, maybe who that child also has if you have multiple subjects. But thinking about how you can get them to give you that honest feedback in that survey, right? About their fears, about, I always have a question on there about what is one thing that you worry might affect your performance in my class, right? And sometimes the answers to that are ones that almost bring me to tears. But that's the kind of information that helps us be able to really address our students' needs. But I'm advocating, I think, that I have to be willing to put out there, especially in this sort of cold virtual space. I had to be willing to warm it up by sharing really honestly with kiddos about myself, right? Like helping build empathy. I talk about that in some of my writing about building empathy, not only between each other, but also for me. Like how do I help them understand that I'm human? And that helps kind of bridge with them to create that transparency and get them to tell me what they want right out of the class. I appreciate that question too, because at the bottom of my pyramid I showed earlier is purpose, right? Like the foundation for a culture of learning is that everyone has a shared purpose. And so, you know, from the first week of class, this is our purpose, and just work on it together. Here's why we're here. Here's why we're here. Let's do this. And you just keep coming back to that throughout the whole 9-week semester, however long you're with these kiddos.
So other questions or thoughts for Leah regarding the plan that she shared? Jamie wrote in the chat that she loves the plan, so that's great.
Well, true. And well, thank you. And I was going to just say, it's also true that it's going to look different for everyone. You know, she just said that, you know, she teaches choir. And if you're in a PE class, you're going to have to think about logistics of that, right? Like that's a whole nother set of cultural thinking that you have to do. If I'm working with kindergartners versus, you know, 7th graders and 8th graders, there's something that happens, by the way, between like 6th grade and 11th grade where nobody wants to turn their camera on. And then like I found my 11th and 12th graders don't care, they'll do it. But 6 through 10, they're mortified, right, by this idea, or like 7 through 10 really is when it happens, of seeing themselves on a screen. But everybody who's like kindergarten through 6, man, they just want to see themselves. I mean, at least that's kind of been my observation that I've noticed here lately. So like, how do we adapt, you know, again, that's why I kind of gave you a blank matrix maybe to think about, like, what are my set of circumstances? How can I use this to sort of address the needs of my learners and the culture that really we want to build together in our classroom? So if anybody has any other questions, just type them in the chat room. I have a couple more things I just want to show you. Some of you might have already jumped ahead. I don't know if I can still, Paul.
So let me give you the hosting rights. Hold on.
You took away my privileges. It's okay.
You should be good.
Okay. I'm a toggler, so I'm apologizing. I wanted to show you what this looked like sort of and how we adapted in my own classroom. So there in the blue are community agreements that were made by some older students of mine. And this was for like a government class where we had a lot of potentially wicked, hairy conversations, right? But what was really amazing is that my other classes, once they saw those community agreements, they said, let's try those on. So this kind of became sort of the community agreements for all grade levels that I taught last year. And then this year we made some new ones because I do this process of community agreement creation every year. And I really, really strongly recommend that you do this, whether we're virtual or physical next year, that you make community agreements that your students develop and then are willing to hold each other accountable to. So what then happened for us was some clarifications here for virtual space. And when we meet, these are at the top of our Google Doc where we have our shared learning together. So we start with our community agreements, the clarifications for virtual space, and some of these are ones that Paul, you shared at the beginning for sort of the norms for your group. And this is sort of our modification that I have seen happen, okay, that we have made. And then I have some resources and links here for you. Again, if you just go to the tiny URL / Leah Ross Henry culture, all of these links are here. And I wanted to just really quickly explain why I put them in here. The National Equity Project has a protocol for creating community agreements that I went through with a team that was really eye-opening for me. NSRF's protocol is also a really good one. that's really simple and adaptable for a digital space too. There's some sample agreements here. I gave you kind of a breadth of them. EL Education has a video that walks you through their processes. And then here's some articles that I found that relate sort of to the need for creating a healthy culture in your classroom, and thinking about norming, community agreements, and like just generally cultural buckets that you might consider building in your own classroom as you work through developing that for next year. So again, none of this is going to work if we don't plan. And I think right now, the one thing I'm certain about is that I don't know what next year will be. I don't know if it's going to be virtual. I don't know if it's going to be physical. But here's what I know. I know I have to be proactive about my culture, or I'm going to hate teaching next year. We have got to focus on that. We have got to focus on creating a community of people who are there to learn and helping meet their needs the best we can. I also would just like to add that this is by no means saying that we shouldn't focus on social, emotional, and physical needs, because it's always Maslow before Bloom's, 100%. I hope you can tell I'm that kind of a teacher. That's my priority. I'll give my kids a meal before I worry about their homework packet. But if we're able to get everybody to a place where they can be a learner, please attend to your culture. I think time-wise, I'm about there to 10 minutes, Fred, so I think I did okay with that one.
It's great, Leah. Thank you. And really an informative presentation, certainly lots to think about. Appreciated you sharing of your resources. And again, those are in that tiny URL, which we shared out earlier. And before we wrap up, so we can get you to wherever you need to be at 1 o'clock, or rather 2 o'clock, any questions for Leah regarding some of her thinking, the plan that she shared, details in her presentation, the Padlet? Alberta said, really love the Padlet experience. So that's great.
And thank you guys for coming. I really appreciate seeing sort of people and knowing that you're there. As my one-room schoolhouse of teaching pre-K all through first grade, and then jumping into my high school kids that I teach here in Putnam County, Indiana. So thank you for being gracious host. And if anybody has any follow-up questions, I'm just leahrosshenry@gmail.com. And I'd love to engage with you on Twitter. I hope that's okay, Fred, if I say that. Like, I host PBL chat on Tuesday nights. And so if you are a Twitter user, I'm just at Leah Ross Henry, and I'd love to engage with you there. I get a lot of learning out of my professional learning network on Twitter. So I highly recommend that as a tool for you to use too.
Thank you, Leah. What I'm doing is I'm adding a few final items into the chat. You'll see there's a feedback survey that you can feel free to share your thinking on. And then what I'm also adding is our PL on the go placemat for this week. We've got some fantastic opportunities to learn together that are coming up throughout the week. We hope that you'll join us tomorrow and then Wednesday. And in fact, for those of you who maybe your Monday is kind of wrapping up and you've got an hour kind of continued learning for yourself, we've got an elementary math strategy session starting up at 2 o'clock that you can find on the placemat as well. So again, we want to thank you for being here, Leah. We want to thank you for facilitating a great session. Please feel free to reach out to Leah via Twitter and join PBL chat every Tuesday at 9:30 p.m. So thanks so much for being here.